Witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie na kolejnej debacie Forum Dialog Plus imienia Andrzeja Godlewskiego. Debata powstała dzięki Fundacji Ars Republica w osobie Małgorzaty Neigebauer. Debata by się nie odbyła, gdyby nie partnerstwo Fundacji Konrada Adenauera w Polsce oraz Fundacji Współpracy Polsko-Niemieckiej. Drodzy Państwo, temat naszej dzisiejszej debaty to rosyjska emigracja, siła, jedność, możliwości. Czy Rosjanie na emigracji staną się łącznikiem Rosji z Zachodem? Drodzy Państwo, nasza dzisiejsze spotkanie będzie się odbywało w języku angielskim. Ja się nazywam Marcin Piasecki, jestem dziennikarzem Rzeczpospolitej i będę miał przyjemność poprowadzić nasze spotkanie. Szanowni Państwo, łączymy się dzisiaj z kilku europejskich stolic, to oczywiście Warszawa, ale także Tallin, Berlin czy Bruksela. A moimi gośćmi są pan dr Igor Gretskiy, niezależny rosyjski politolog, były wykładowca Petersburskiego Uniwersytetu Państwowego od 2022 roku na emigracji, aktualnie analityk estońskiego think tanku ICDS. Dzień dobry, panie doktorze.
Dzień dobry.
Moim gościem jest również pani Barbara von Au-Freitag, dziennikarka, ekspertka do spraw społeczeństwa obywatelskiego w Europie Wschodniej, na Kaukazie Południowym i w Azji Środkowej. Członek zarządu Praskiego Centrum Obywatelskiego. Thank you, good morning. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you.
Moim gościem jest również pan Roland Freudenstein, dyrektor oddziału Fundacji Wolna Rosja w Brukseli. Dzień dobry, panie dyrektorze.
Dzień dobry, witam, good morning.
During our meeting, we'll consider the potential of Russian emigration and the role it can play in the democratization process in Russia. Let's start with the presentation by Mr. Gretskiy. Mr. Gretskiy, the floor is screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think that I would like to give a brief kind of overview of the research conducted within the ICDS during this year, and it's about new Russian immigration. And when we talk about new Russian immigration, it's always a big problem. There has always been a big problem. What number of people are we talking about? And we try to assess this number. And if there is an opportunity to start the presentation, I'd be sorry for the scripts. It's due to the conflict between Mac and non-Mac systems. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the Russian immigration, it's one can find a lot of different numbers about those who emigrated from Russia, and those numbers are mostly exaggerated. Some analysts believe that 1 million up to 5 million people emigrated, but there are no reasonable kind of explanations behind those figures. Another problem was that many publications on the topic they put a lot of hope on those people who emigrated, believing that those Russians who left their homeland in February 2022, they will necessarily gone back, and the West has to provide
We have technical problems. I hope that Mr. Gretskiy will be back.
Hello?
Hello? Yes, we hear you. Okay.
So the general idea among Western analysts is that those people who left Russia back in February 2022, they will return back, and we, the West, have to provide them with everything necessary in order they could start building their new society when the political situation changes inside Russia. And they tend to believe that this new Russian immigration would become a future political elite, or at least they would be useful when it comes to disseminating democratic ideas, both among immigrant communities in the West or among the population in Russia. In the meantime, some of those publications, they downplay or completely ignore some security concerns. That was a huge problem. And I have doubts about using this term that is getting more and more popular, that is war-induced immigration, because, it is used in a way that before February 2022, there was no immigration from Russia to other countries. So all that immigration is war-induced, but in fact, it's only a part of it. And our task was actually to assess its scope. Next slide, please. So actually, we've interviewed 27 interviewees, aged from 19 to 66 years old, and in such countries like the Baltic states, Finland, Poland, and Germany, of course. And we tried to do our best in order not to pick all our respondents from one bubble. We've interviewed people from Tallinn, Tartu, Klaipėda, Vilnius, Nuremberg, Berlin, and others, from some places that they call kind of immigrant camps, where they are waiting for the outcome of their application for a status. But also, it was already visible, it was already clear that the general flow of new Russian immigration is directed to Germany. So additionally, we've talked to 3 heads of major NGOs, German NGOs, who deal with Russian immigration on a professional basis in order to check our hypothesis. And that was quite interesting conversations, I would say. When it comes to the numbers, we used statistics. We submitted requests to national offices responsible for migration and statistics. And when it comes to terminology, immigrant or emigrant, we use the EU regulation, which describes that the person may be regarded as an immigrant if he or she intends or stays in the territory of a member state for longer, for at least 12 months. So next slide, please. We can see that the biggest, the most important source when they assess immigration is the number of valid permits, and we can see that it grows over time. And it's it's not that reliable when it comes to. It does not suit our purposes, because actually there are people who resubmit or renovate their permits and so on and so forth. So for that particular reason, we need to use first long-term resident permits. And I would like, next slide, please. Yes, and another one. Next, please. Yes, and when it comes to the first long-term permits issued to Russian nationals, we can see how this number was growing, and a considerable spike happened in 2022 and 2023. But it's important to note that before the invasion, the level of migration from Russia to the European Union was about 52,000 long-term permits issued to Russian nationals. And everything that exceeds this threshold may represent the invasion-induced immigration from Russia. And it's about 67,000 during the 2 years of 22 and 23. Next slide, please. How much is it a big number or not? Well, actually, the number of migrants in the European Union grows constantly. But when it comes to Russian nationals, their number of Russian migrants is growing not that fast. And in comparison to 2014, the share of Russian nationals among the foreign nationals with first long-term permits even decreased. And I would say even more that in comparison to Belarusian immigration to the European Union, the figures of Russian immigration are very modest. Belarusian immigration comprised of 0.4% in 2014, and now it's about 2.5, 2.6. So Belarusian immigration to the European Union grew significantly. Next slide, please. And when it comes to the countries, when it comes to particular countries, Germany, of course, in the lead. It's, I would say, the capital, like the biggest hub of new Russian immigration, but Spain on the second place. And the next two countries are Cyprus and Portugal. When it comes to Cyprus, in 2022, the authorities, the government of this country issued almost 7 times more first residence permits to Russian nationals. But overall, when it comes to the year of 2024, that is this year, it's already visible that the number of those permits is decreasing, is going down. So the peak of this new Russian immigration has already passed, in my view. The next slide, please. But it's not only about first long-term permits. That is, there's another part, there's another source of data. It's a decision granting temporary protection, which is not included in the Eurostat data about new Russian immigrants. Initially, temporary protection is an instrument, is a tool that is being widely used by the EU governments with regard to Ukrainian refugees. But a small number of Russian nationals use this opportunity to leave their country too. And Germany here is on the lead. At Poland and Spain, they are following Germany. And overall, in 2022 and 2023, about 12,000 of Russian nationals used this opportunity. Next slide, please. This is in general, so in total, 178,000 Russian nationals left country for the European Union in 22-23. But out of those 178,000, only 74,000 may be regarded as a kind of invasion-induced immigration. And now I'd like to tell a couple of, I'd like to make several points with regard to the political preferences of the new Russian immigration. Next slide, please. In general, we can divide it into kind of two waves. The spring wave, which comprised mostly of IT specialists with their families, but also civic and political activists, journalists, and representatives of the academia. But the biggest part of it, of course, IT specialists with their families. Some analysts believe that this share might reach up to 45%. More realistically, it's about 30%. But IT specialists, IT guys, their reasons to emigrate were not related to politics. They believe that since the West introduced harsh sanctions with regard to kind of software issues, most of the big companies, they were about to switch to Russian-made software, and it would kind of limit their opportunities to compete on the global market for best paid jobs, first. And second, they were afraid of being tied to the Russian job markets forever. So their reasons to emigrate had almost nothing in common with politics. Autumn wave, it was mostly about draft evaders. They are kind of regarded as less politicized. The overwhelming majority didn't have experience of dealing with law enforcement agencies, and they are very careful when describing their characterization of invasion, of Russian foreign policy, and all the stuff. Is very neutral, I would say. Next slide, please. Why the people, why the Russians decided to emigrate to the EU? The first two reasons probably are the most important ones. First of all, it's all about professional contacts. Those ones who had professional contacts or experience of dealing with their colleagues in Europe, they had better chances to emigrate. And it was important for those ones who were actively involved in political activism or journalists or representatives of academia, but it was not relevant for IT guys, since their confidence, their belief that they are capable enough to find a job independently was considerably higher in comparison to those political activists and other representatives of the spring wave. The second reason is family ties. Some of them had relatives. The third reason, it is mostly about LGBT plus and ethnic minorities. They believe that the European Union is a safe place with welcome, with a friendly atmosphere of respect to their needs, to their rights. And the fourth factor is probably it's about so-called magnetic effect of welfare. Quite a lot of respondents, those ones who ended up in Finland, for instance, or in the Baltic states or in Poland, they said that initially their goal was Germany, and since they had Finnish visa or Polish visa, they made a stop in Finland or Poland respectively, but they do not exclude that they would eventually go to Germany. Next slide, please. Of course, the new Russian immigration faced adaptation challenges, and the most important, most difficult ones are the first two, language and employment, and they are interconnected. Before the invasion began, there was quite optimistic. There were quite optimistic assessments with regard to the level of education of the Russian middle class. But even for those ones who work professionally with Russian immigration, it was a surprise that the level of English language was not that good when it comes to new Russian immigration. By the NGO's assessment, up to 60% of those ones who arrived to Germany, for instance, from Russia after February 2022, about 60% of new Russian immigrants, they have problems in communicating with local authorities and communities in English, let alone other languages. Employment, this is something, this is another problem for the new Russian immigration, and is interconnected. Without knowledge of foreign languages, it's very difficult to find employment. And it's interesting that new Russian immigrants, they tend to find jobs in Russian-speaking segments. And those segments are already highly competitive and not that big in all the countries that we studied. The third reason, the third challenge is new social environment. I mean, it's psychologically very difficult to adapt to new system of coordinates. And fourth one is about different living standards. So next slide, please. And attitudes, well, I would like to talk a little bit the attitudes of new Russian immigration. First of all, the kind of many found themselves losing touch with the Russian population. Quite often in the interviews, they told us that we do not feel, they use this word, we do not feel what's going on in Russia. We do not feel how kind of what is the situation in my native city or in Moscow and Saint Petersburg. Another thing is that they tend to believe that kind of and in most cases, those ones who identify themselves as political activists, they tend to believe that people in Russia, the majority, they either kind of do not support the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or they do believe, I mean, the majority does believe that that people are very supportive of the invasion of Ukraine in Russia, but it's because they are subjects of manipulation by the Russian authorities. So it's for the new Russian immigration, it's very difficult to accept that people in Russia, inside Russia, they are adult people, they are grown up, they have their own beliefs, they have all their experience, life experience, and their own social environment, and they are capable of taking their own choices and decisions. In general, new Russian immigration disobjectivize the population inside Russia. Some of our respondents, they were quite disappointed with the fact that when the invasion took place, there were no major mass protests, and even in the kitchens, like private talks, people did not object against the invasion, the atrocities, looting, and so on and so forth. So, next slide, please. It's a very sensitive issue, collective responsibility, which divides deeply the new Russian immigration. A majority does not agree with the very concept of collective political responsibility, and they call it a fascistoid idea. So having a collective political responsibility, they believe is wrong. Some of the new Russian immigration, they admit that Russians bear responsibility, but actually they still believe that this responsibility kind of is not full, is not just because Russians are manipulated by propaganda and so on and so forth. We've also noticed that some tones of whataboutism and resentment toward the West among the new Russian immigration, because many argued that the West should at least share this responsibility for the war in Ukraine. as they were engaged in trade, purchasing Russian oil, Russian natural gas, and paying money for that, which is used by Vladimir Putin to buy weapons and so on and so forth. There is one distinct group that clearly does not associate itself with Russian society, is ethnic minorities. They believe that they have nothing in common with collective responsibility of Russia, of Russian people, since they were treated badly when they were in Russia, and they felt themselves as strangers. Next slide, please. Political activism in Russia is on decline. It comes from our interviews, and there are several reasons for that. One of them is that most people, they are focused on practical tasks. Other ones, they feel apathy towards Russian opposition politicians since there are no results, or they said, well, the Russian opposition, they try to change things for quite a lot of time, and we do not have any success stories. Some of them were very frustrated. They got very frustrated after Alexei Navalny was assassinated. And the third reason is that there is a reflexive rejection of any leaders. There is a suspicion to the very institution of leadership. I was present at one of the events organized by the Russian immigration activists, and one of them proposed an idea to kind of find a leader in order to kind of be more effective in communicating with the Western authorities. But the answer was that we do not need another Politburo. So there is a disregard, there's a very, very deep suspicion with regard to very institution of leadership. Next slide, please. Another very important problem is the visa and travel restrictions. And New Russian immigration sees it from a very Russia-centric positions. They believe that actually the sanctions were introduced due to two reasons. The first one is that the Western governments, they are trying to change the political regime in Russia. And second reason for sanctions they see is that the sanctions were introduced in order to stop the war. So if the war is not stopped and if there are no changes, political changes inside Russia, so they believe that the sanctions are ineffective. And they totally disregard the very fact that those restrictions were introduced for security reasons. So this argument actually is not present in their perspective. Next slide, please. Another sensitive, probably the most sensitive issue is about donations to the Ukrainian army. It's like, Ukrainian army. And for most communities, donating to the Ukrainian army is totally unacceptable. And for some communities, it's a taboo topic. What were the explanations? Pacifist views. As one of the most popular explanation. Another explanation is that there are a lot of people and governments who provide help to Ukraine, but who would take care of us, and so on and so forth. And the third reason is that people simply are not interested in political issues. They are too concentrated on their current activities, on their routine, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. It's interesting that the new Russian immigration tend to see Russia's future in a very bleak and negative terms. They do not see that, they do not expect a better future for Russia would be possible in the near future. Very few people remain optimists. Most of them are kind of professional political activists, I would say. And they tend to explain this like in a way that if a new government in Russia comes, if a new leader appears, if this leader conquers their hearts and minds, if this leader would be trustful, then they would think about returning back to Russia. And those ones who have families, they said that they would not risk taking their families with them. And in my view, this is very important. Next slide.
Mr. Gretskiy, our time is limited, so
okay, yes. Okay, could you please then switch to the next slide, and that will be the last one. Yes, the prospects for returning to Russia. Majority is not going to return to Russia. They are actually afraid of decreasing quality of life. They're afraid of risks connected to demobilization. They do not want to live with people who return back from war. They cannot imagine how they would live together with those ones who supported this war. And of course, LGBTQ plus and ethnic minorities, they are in no way willing to return back to Russia for understandable reasons. And in many ways, so when they say that all those if the window of opportunity opens, if they saying that means that they do not consider themselves as agents of change. That would be my last point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And what do you think? What is the potential of Russian emigrants? Mrs. Barbara Au-Freitag, what is your opinion?
Well, I think our task is neither to romanticize nor to go into the other extreme and become too bleak and disparaging also of what we still have in terms of active energy in the emigration mode. I really appreciate research. Thank you very much. I think it's really important for us to constantly update our knowledge of who we have and how many we have. I think your numerical research is very, very convincing. I see a great benefit in describing the adaptation challenges, but I think we have moved beyond that in the last year. And we have an immigration that is no longer just complaining, but shifting into a sort of what they call themselves a courage of doom, without having any illusions about the impact they can have, working for minimal change, being exhausted and worn out, but continuing to do what they think is meaningful. I admit that my perspective comes very much from Berlin, and you have described very well and shown in your graphics that Germany has become the main pole of attraction and of active energy in Russian immigration in Europe. I can feel it here every day. There's a lot of vibrant activity, a lot of convening, a lot of discussions, a lot of dynamics that I think in other countries don't exist to this point. So perhaps my view is tainted by this perception of a very strong core Russian emigre activism, which is developing here in Berlin. But I think that is the chance we have. A lot of the heads and faces of the main civic society organizations built over the last 30 years are now in Europe, and we have helped to train them. We have cooperated with them. Germany has had the most, always traditionally since 45, the most active web of people-to-people contacts, of incredible amounts of civic ties. So there hasn't just been Nord Stream and the political and commercial interest. There's a specificity about German societal relations to Russia. And therefore, I think much survives here, which doesn't live anywhere else. And from that perspective, I'm very ready to give a lot of good examples and also to reflect on the potential that we still have in what I see as the rest of an active Russian civil society and independent media.
Thank you very much. And what is the perspective from the Brussels, Mr. Roland Froddenstein?
Thank you very much, panie redaktorze. The perspective from Brussels is a particular perspective because, you know, as you said, I'm the director of the Brussels office of the Free Russia Foundation. And I must say, the Russian emigres that I work with every day, and there's a lot of them, do not fit the description that Igor Gretskiy has given so eloquently with so much statistical data in his presentation. It's quite the contrary. These people have a mission. They have values. They clearly acknowledge responsibility, not guilt, but responsibility. We can get to that distinction later on. I mean, German philosopher Karl Jaspers after World War II had a quite elaborate and quite convincing theory about this. But we'll get into that later on. And these people are absolutely clear that a Ukrainian victory in this war with Russia is a necessary, though not sufficient, precondition for any improvement of things in Russia. So, all right, these may be small numbers, but these people count. I mean, we have offices in 10 countries. We have quite elaborate projects. Just 2 weeks ago, we advised the representatives of member states in the European Council, in the working group on Eastern Europe, about sanctions. It was a very intense 1.5 hours where I believe that my colleagues from the Free Russia Foundation had a lot of advice to give, how to make the sanctions bite better. And let me conclude with this personal observation. Maybe it's a thing about my age, you know, the older you get, the more déjà vu experiences you have. But let me just bring up the 1980s. I was a student in West Germany, and I was absolutely fascinated by anti-communist resistance in Poland, right? So I got into Polish emigre circles. And you know, at that time, statistically, the emigracja zarobkowa, it was called, you know, the people who left Poland for material reasons was far eclipsing the few people that were political activists. So I decided to work with them, you know, traveling to Poland, smuggling stuff through the border, you know, helping underground structures in Poland and so on. All that was possible. And what was interesting was the reaction of my fellow West Germans. Basically, I'll sum it up like this. Roland, your Polish friends, they seem to have a lot of time. They talk from morning to night. Not all makes sense. No one knows whether anything is going to change in their home country. We're talking 1985, 1986, okay? No one knows whether anything is ever going to change in Poland. If anything ever changes, these people will be the last ones to play a decisive role, you know, because of the way they talk, the way they deal with time and so on. They are totally disunited. You know, Lech Wałęsa was under house arrest and was despised by Polish intellectuals at the time. And 10% of them are probably agents of Polish intelligence anyway. Does that ring a bell? Does that sound familiar? To me, it sounds very familiar when I look at what Mr. Gretskiy has just presented us with. And it's an attitude that he's not alone, of course, but I hear this a lot. And what is actually a little bit sad, I hear this a lot from the very people or the descendants, the sons and daughters of those Polish dissidents in the 1980s who I decided to work with, no matter what their concrete perspectives were. So, sorry to get a little bit emotional. You know, when Germans get emotional, the rest of Europe takes cover, usually for good reason. But I had to get rid of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Barbara von Au-Freitag.
I would just like to add on a less emotional side that to me, the potential of the Russian immigration is quite amply proved every day by the persistent persecution that the FSB still places in this field. You know, it is relentless, it's non-stopping, it is transnational, and it hits the most renowned people. I mean, the former head of the Sakharov Center, Sergei Lukashevsky, has been sentenced in absentia to 8 years in prison. And Sergei Davidis, who does the wonderful work of Memorial for Political Prisoners, has been called a terrorist, labeled a terrorist, just literally 10 days ago. The homes of families of those who run the independent media, like iStories, for instance, her home of her parents in Russia, where she hasn't been for years and years and years, was raided and her mother interrogated. So to me, I think we have to understand that everything the FSB takes seriously in its potential role definitely still has some power, something they fear, and something they feel the need to persecute. So I think that is one element we have to be aware of.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Igor Gretskiy, what is your answer?
Well, actually, I'm not sure if I'm capable of adding more optimism to what Roland and Barbara said, since and if it's quite obvious that the new Russian immigration has very limited access to the Russian population. And yes, Barbara mentioned the Russian media. About 80 Russian media moved abroad, but first of all, they lost their audience. And second, they confessed themselves that even one of the representatives of FBK this year said that whatever they did, whatever they produced on their YouTube channels, the maximum potential of this protest audience in Russia is about 10 million people. So whatever they did, that is their maximum. And there are other research that simply were not that optimistic, and they assessed this potentially opposition audience from 5 to 7 million of Russian populace. And when it comes to civil society and what Roland said about Poland, I believe that there is no need in drawing parallels with Poland, since Russia is not Poland. Within the Russian population, there is a very suspicious attitude with regard to those ones who left the country. They say that it's a cut of a slice of bread, so you cannot rewind the time and put it together. So the leaders of the Russian opposition, they have no moral authority, kind of this influence over the population in Russia. They do not perceive the leaders of the Russian opposition as their moral authorities. And when it comes to kind of Russia, they do not feel that respect with regard to those ones who left. I believe that those historical parallels with Poland are not precise.
Thank you very much. I see your signs, but I have the question. The question which is, I think, very good for this part of our discussion. The question is from our viewer, Profesor Józef Niżnik z Polskiej Akademii Nauk, and the question is: do Russians working abroad to democratize Russia have anyone to talk to in Russia itself? Mr. Roland, what is your remark, your observation?
Yeah, direct answer to this before I come to Igor. My colleagues, most of my colleagues in the Free Russia Foundation have regular podcasts or other publications on social media. Usually it works via YouTube. YouTube is still open. I mean, it's being slowed down by jamming in Russia, but young and dynamic people, millennials, have ways to deal with that. So these podcasts have altogether a two-digit number of followers daily, 2 million followers daily. So we're talking about 10 million plus, right? And if you add those who regularly consume on a, let's say, weekly or so basis, you get to somewhere between 30 and 40 million. All right. So this is already an enormous potential to counteract a Kremlin propaganda, and it is being used by my colleagues in messaging back to Russians at home. The fact that they don't protest in the streets has very different reasons, and many reasons, and one of them is fear. But the potential of Russian exiles in precisely messaging to Russia with a different sensitivity and a different ability to communicate than, let's say, Western media to Russians on a daily basis. I think this is one of the big pluses of Russian immigrants. And about the historical comparability of Poland and Russia, well, no two cases are ever comparable. You know, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And what I'm saying is that the attitude of, by the way, Poles in Poland vis-a-vis their own political emigration in the 1980s was not rosy. The people who left Poland were, in the eyes of the people who stayed, were people who ditched their country in the most difficult times. There were people who believed they know it all because they're in the West, and when they returned, whether it was in business or in politics, they were considered with a great deal of suspicion and disrespect. So, you know, I mean, this tension between the society at home and the emigres is a universal thing in countries. And I would say that the bigger the country, the bigger the problems and the psychological recriminations on both sides. There are very few cases of former dictatorships that have made 100% positive use of their immigration. And those are usually very small countries. I would say Slovenia and Estonia come to mind. But Poland in the 1990s, the relationship between the former emigres and the Polish population was not harmonious. And, you know, it's no coincidence that even Zbigniew Brzezinski never ran for president in Poland, let alone any of the more recent Polish immigrants. I think the only case that you might put in here would be Radosław Sikorski, the current Polish foreign minister, who just spent 10 years in England before he returned to Poland and started a political career. But anyway, so what I'm comparing here is the reaction of the rest of the world to political emigres from a given country and their fraught relationship of those emigres between themselves and the population at home. And there are very, very clear parallels to be drawn between Poland in the 80s and Russia today. Now, this does not mean that Russia has attacked a neighboring country or that Poland has attacked a neighboring country in the 1980s, or that in any way Putin is comparable to Jaruzelski. That is clear. But let's not forget that in the mid-1980s, Solidarność was a spent force, right? It consisted of a couple of hundred people in prison, a couple of thousand activists, maybe some people that were, some people that were still developing underground structures. But it's, you know, seen from today, the history of dissidents in Central Europe in the 1980s seems glorious, because we all knew that in the end their cause won. That was by no means clear. And if the recent days in, let's say, countries like South Korea and Syria, as different as they are, but if they hold one lesson for Mr. Putin and everybody who is watching him, it is that things can change very quickly. You know, autocracies erode slowly until they collapse, and that can happen very quickly. So I'm not saying that the Russian emigres today will rule Russia in the future. That is, I mean, even they themselves don't believe that. But they can play a crucial role. And you know, the question of returning or staying in the West in the 21st century with possibilities to oscillate between countries is a moot question. It's not about staying forever here, moving forever there. It is a question of helping to engender change and to make it stick. And that is where Russian emigres can actually play a very crucial role in the future of Russia, which is a free future, as I believe.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Barbara Freitag.
Yes, I would like to expand on this also, because I think it is a very important question for all of us to understand, also to decide whether and how to support these exile groups. So I think this is not about optimism, as you say, or about a romanticism, but it is also not about giving up something that is small, and Roland has described it very well, as we are witnessing time and again in despaired times. I mean, think of the Syrian opposition, you know, of an isolated and discouraged community. I don't see it, by the way, impervious to security concerns anymore of Western restrictions. I think there has, in over 3 years, there has been a much greater census for accepting why they get accepted in the limited way they are, that humanitarian visa are a huge privilege, especially in Germany, where they are connected with the ability to work. And so the mood to me is one of sort of somber realism, not exaggerating one's own role. And I'm always talking, by the way, if Roland talks much more about political opposition, I'm talking of independent media and civic activism, as I am in touch with on a daily basis. So I think on the connection, to come back to this question of the connection to Russians inside the country, it's really something I do not agree with your report, Mr. Gretskiy, is the connection of independent media into Russia. I mean, if one does look at the figures just of the two major portals, Doge Television and Medusa, I mean, the figures are very, very impressive. You know, you have Doge with 40 million monthly views just in 1 month in October, you know, of which they can prove that 70% are people reaching them in Russia. The same is with Medusa. Although the website is blocked, they reach a total of 16 to 20 million people every month, of which again 60 to 70% are living in Russia. So I think one cannot underestimate these seeds of alternatives information still reaching Russian audiences and being shared. There's also a new women's portal, which I think is an interesting project, Koza. You know, it is a very unpolitical, it is really news for women, about women, ranging really from quite banal and trivial topics, but also, of course, to the losses at the front and to serious social issues like domestic violence rising as a result of this war, but in a soft way. And I think it's a new project to counter the war fatigue that is emerging also in Russian society, to tap in more on the social effect that this war is having, which other portals like iStories, etc., also do. They report how, you know, the returning veterans who get as heroes of this war get a preferential treatment in access to school education for their children, who get their kids into higher education more easily without any competition that other young people have to go through. They pick up these social and increasingly also economic effects of the war within Russian society, and therefore they reach people. I mean, one of their editors told me just last week, you can't imagine how quickly they are ready to talk to our network of volunteers who interview them, because they have nobody else who listens to them in the deep regions. So I think one cannot really say at this point that there will not be an increasing impact of these alternative platforms as state propaganda. It will not, you know, cover what everyday Russians live through at the moment in an era of rising inflation and isolation from the world. There is a hunger for alternative information, and they still do connect. The same is true for civil society. It is much, much more difficult to speak about it publicly because the initiatives and the grassroots that you refer to in your report, they are mainly partisan today. They are underground in this era of total repression. But as I said, their heads and faces often are in the West. And so you have these broken teams where part of the management and also the strategic thinkers are outside Russia, but the people actually doing the work and building the networks are inside Russia, still communicating over secure channels, only working in very, very small communities. But I can give numerous examples how these ties still exist, with, I say, a sober realism of what they can achieve in today's totalitarian circumstances.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Igor Gretskiy, what is your statement? What is your answer? Again.
Actually, I have I have answers, but I'm not sure if you have time for that.
We have about 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I still insist that those historical parallels, they're false, in fact, and we cannot compare Russia to kind of what's going on in Syria, given that the Syrian opposition, they changed the regime not with likes on YouTube or with what they post on a daily basis in the internet. Heavily weaponed people, very well organized and trained. Those guys changed the regime, and they risked their lives, of course. And I'm not sure if we can see the same picture on the side of the new Russian immigration, right? When it comes to media, well, the most popular electronic outlet is Medusa, definitely, with 8.5 million of unique users per month. But when we just take a look at who follows after them, it's about 1.5 million, 1 million, and kind of 1.2, and so on and so forth. But when they say that, the audience in Russia comprised of 30 or 40 million, I would like to take a look at the methodology, given that they use VPN, first of all. and they never discover their methodology. They only say that their audience is about 40 million and so on and so forth. And when it comes to views, there is kind of viewers and number of subscribers is actually the same. And civil society is a separate issue. I would agree with Barbara that we have to just differentiate between political activism and broader audience. Our respondents, when we asked them about their outreach to their families and relatives in Russia, the overwhelming majority said that they tried to convince people in Russia when they initially, right after the invasion, they discussed the issue of war in Ukraine, but they failed. And now they maintain their ties with the relatives in Russia, with their friends, mostly, but they do not discuss political issue, and Ukraine in particular. So they avoid those issues. So they are aware of their very limited power of persuasion, even when it comes to their closest relatives in Russia. And it reminds a little bit of the Berlin Wall in the information space. So those who emigrated, they mostly anti-Putin, majority of them probably. But those who kind of continue residing in Russia, there is that type of disconnection. And one case I recalled while I was listening to Barbara, back in 2022, we conducted research about those NGOs stayed in Russia, and we had conversations, we had interviews with them, and several of them said that a turning point in their reassessment of the political and social realities in Russia was when the Russian government decided to close down Memorial. Before that moment, Russian activists, NGO employees, they really believed, they felt that they had this mission. They had a sense of mission. They believed that their work, their activities were in need on the side of the broader population. But it turned out when the memorial was closed down, well, it was like it passed unnoticed for the majority of population. No one even noticed that. And since then, many began to reconsider their understanding of what's going on in Russia and what has happened with Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. Barbara,
Can I
please.
just respond quickly on both accounts? First of all, the Berlin Wall, I think, is a very good catchwork as we keep having these historical parallels, because it was so famous that we had one area in the East German in the East Germany, which was around Dresden and Saxonia, which could not receive West German television, and it was always called the Valley of the totally ignorant, because it made
the Valley of the Clueless.
Of the clueless, very good translation, the Ahnungslosen, yes. And so one could actually analyze a complete different level of political awareness by the lack of exposure to alternative sources of information. And the same as you are in Estonia, of course, Estonia has part of its beacon role in political development because it was exposed to Finnish television. And I think, so in a way, this alternative information, it doesn't lead to a revolution. It doesn't lead to the end of the war. It doesn't lead to the beautiful Russia of the future overnight. But what it does, it does infuse some horizontal ties, some alternative understanding of the world, which will be so important to preserve. It's our only hope that the 20% of Russians who don't agree with this war, if I say this blank number that we all refer to, that those people still have the possibility to stay informed, develop their thinking, and have a feeling that they are not completely left alone in a black box. And second, shortly to Memorial, because I'm a founding member of the new Memorial here in Berlin. And I think it is also a very good example how this resilience continues, because the work of memorial continues. The archival work continues, and it has been tough 2 years of just rebuilding the basic structures, and everyone is exhausted and close to burnout as everyone else that I'm talking about. Mental health is now already a huge issue, but the will to save what is possible, to do your best, to stay connected to the original activity that you were building for 30 years, like the Sakharov Center, like Memorial, like the Moscow School of Political Studies, now the School of Civic Studies in Riga. They continue the work under very adverse circumstances, but I think with a deep understanding of why they are doing it, of their mission, and of the limited possibilities they have at the moment, but of thinking that what happens if we don't do even that? We have to keep going what we can do. So this is the spirit that I encounter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roland Freudenstein.
Yes. So what can Russian emigres realistically and constructively contribute to the situation? I already named messaging back home. That's a crucial thing. But also explaining what is happening in this black box that Russia has become to Western decision makers and stakeholders. That's another crucial function. And as I said, my colleagues and I are working on this every day. And third, I think in developing strategies to counter Putin and counter Russian imperialism and aggression, it is imperative to work with Russian emigres. They have a lot of things to contribute to this debate. Again, I speak from day-to-day experience. And, I'm not optimistic, I'm not pessimistic. I say the West should work with those emigres that are there and try to put their input to the best purpose, to the best employment possible. And I think if we observe that rule, we move beyond this optimism, pessimism, doom and gloom, or exaggerated hope scenarios. We need to work with what we have, and it's better to prepare together with Russian emigres for the day when things finally change in Moscow, and that day will come, than not to prepare for that moment. That's my final plea.
Thank you, but I have another question, a very important question, and I think that it will be the final question of our discussion because our time is limited. The discussion is about shape or image of future Russia, which emerges from the discussion with immigrants, Russian immigrants. Mr. Roland, what is the shape? Is it a democracy like in the West or something different?
Look, I mean, there's no doubt that if Russia is to have a future, it needs to say to bid farewell to imperialism. It needs to create structures that observe the rule of law and checks and balances. Whether this is a Westminster democracy or a presidential or parliamentary or whatever democracy, we will see. But checks and balances are indispensable. And the third indispensable corner of this triangle is it has to become a true federation, which it isn't at the moment. Again, my colleagues and I are working on it, developing concepts. I could answer this question with Navalny's famous phrase about "прекрасная будущая Россия." Look, I'm not disputing that people want to have this dream, this attitude. What I'm saying is that we all need to brace for the possibility, of course, that things get worse before they get better, and that that's something I'm telling my Russian colleagues is that don't expect things to be beautiful and flawless and painless immediately. But I have a sneaking suspicion they already know that.
Thank you. And Barbara Freitag, what are your remarks?
Well, I think when I look at the groups that I work with and how they perceive the Russia that they are working for, it is far from prekrasnaya and any sort of delusions of change into a democratic direction. What they work for and what I fully support is to preserve strong voices for a return to basic respect for human rights in Russia, which have completely disappeared in this age of total crackdown, repression, torture, and loss of life, and waste of an entire generation at the front. The second would be for, like Roland said, for an emerging de-imperialization in the thinking and the self-understanding of this future Russia, that the neighbors will be respected in their own sovereignty. But at the same time, also, what hasn't emerged yet and is only in very small groups, Mr. Gretskiy, you mentioned the ethnic minorities as a group that doesn't, of course, support the war. They are the cannon fodder for this war. And I am in close contact with several groups here in Berlin, and I see their struggle to be accepted even into the normal ranks of the Russian emigre groups. And I hope that as these years of hibernation pass, there will be a development to accept the non-Russian parts of Russia as a natural part of a future Russia, which deserves more respect, more equality, more autonomy in a decentralized and regionalized Russia emerging. So I think these 3 points would be my focus.
Thank you.
Any more?
Thank you. And what is the focus of Mr. Igor Gretskiy?
Well, I have to say that when it comes to our respondents, a majority does not expect that Russia would become normal, like they mentioned, democratic state in the nearest future. And they actually do not have that picture, in fact. They expect that some of them, they believe that Russia would become more like North Korea. Others believe that it will be the second Iran. And the majority do not share this picture of Alexei Navalny, the beautiful Russia of the future, like Roland mentioned that. And most of them disillusioned. Their distance regarding this concept of the beautiful Russia of the future is getting bigger. And another thing is that there are those attitudes with regard to the Russian future are even more diverse when we take not only new Russian immigration, but the previous so-called post-Crimean wave of Russian immigration to the European Union, or even the immigration of 1990s, which is much more sympathetic about Vladimir Putin and his foreign policies. So this is not that simple issue, and I'm not that convinced that it is possible to merge, to unite, to find a common understanding in such a very important issue like the future of Russia among the Russian immigration.
So, thank you very much for our meeting, for our discussion. As I mentioned, our time is limited. Discussion was very, very interesting. Thank you very much again. Bardzo Państwu dziękuję za nasze spotkanie. Bardzo dziękuję za tę niezwykle interesującą dyskusję. I hope that we will have the possibility to meet again in the future. Thank you very much. Jeszcze raz Państwu dziękuję. Dziękuję również naszym widzom za uwagę i oczywiście zapraszam na kolejną dyskusję Forum Dialog Plus już w nowym 2025 roku. I jeszcze raz przypomnę, że naszą debatę oglądaliśmy dzięki Fundacji Ars Republica, Fundacji Konrada Adenauera w Polsce i Fundacji Współpracy Polsko-Niemieckiej. Jeszcze raz Państwu dziękuję. Thank you very, very much. Thank you so much.